During dinner with my parents, she said, "I'm just waiting for him to mature, emotionally and financially." My mom asked what she meant. She said, "Well, look at this restaurant." I excused myself, paid the bill, and left. She had to call her brother for a ride. I, 32M, walked out during a family dinner after what she said. Now everyone's calling me immature. I should have seen it coming. Looking back now, the signs were all there, scattered like breadcrumbs I was too distracted to notice. But that night at the restaurant, sitting across from my parents with her beside me, everything crystallized into one brutal moment of clarity. We'd been together for 3 years. 3 years of what I thought was building something real. She worked part-time at a boutique while finishing her master's degree, and I'd been supportive throughout. I covered most of our expenses, never making a big deal about it, because I figured we were partners. I made decent money as a project manager, nothing extravagant, but comfortable. She always had opinions about how I spent it, though. Little comments here and there about my car being too practical, my watch being too plain, my clothes being too boring. My parents had come into town for the weekend, and she'd been insistent about taking them to this specific restaurant. Not suggested. Insisted. It was this upscale Italian place downtown, the kind with cloth napkins and waiters who described every dish like it was a sonnet. I'd made the reservation, not thinking much of it. My parents were easygoing people who would have been just as happy with pizza, but she'd been adamant. The evening started normally enough. Dad talked about his new woodworking project, Mom asked about her studies, and we all made pleasant conversation over appetizers. I remember feeling content, watching the people I loved most getting along. My mother had always been perceptive, though, had this way of reading between lines that most people missed entirely. She'd been watching us throughout dinner, my mother had. I caught her observing how my girlfriend barely looked at me when I spoke, how she'd light up discussing luxury brands with Mom, but glaze over when Dad talked about anything practical. And then my girlfriend made a comment about her friend's engagement ring, specifically about the size of the diamond. Mom had asked her, friendly enough, what she thought about my perspectives on those kinds of things. That's when it happened. My girlfriend had laughed, this light dismissive sound that made my spine straighten instinctively. She told my mother not to worry, that she was just waiting for me to mature, emotionally and financially. The table went quiet. Dad's fork had stopped halfway to his mouth. Mom had this look on her face, that careful neutral expression she wore when she was actively stopping herself from saying something sharp. I'd asked her what she meant by that, keeping my voice level even though something cold was spreading through my chest. She'd glanced around the restaurant then, this sweeping look that took in the crystal chandeliers and the marble floors and the other diners in their expensive clothes. She'd gestured vaguely and said that surely I could see what she meant. Just look at this restaurant. Look at where we were. She'd said it like it was obvious, like I was being deliberately obtuse for not understanding. The implication was clear. This wasn't good enough. I wasn't good enough. This place I'd chosen, that I was paying for, that I'd specifically reserved because she'd insisted on it, somehow proved her point about my inadequacy. My mother had started to say something, her face hardening in that way it did when someone crossed a line with her children, but I'd already pushed back my chair. The scraping sound cut through the low murmur of conversation around us. I'd excused myself, told them I needed to use the restroom, and walked toward the back of the restaurant. But I didn't go to the restroom. I went straight to our waiter, caught him near the kitchen, and told him I needed the check immediately for our table. He'd looked confused, asking if everything was all right, and I'd just repeated that I needed the check now. He'd processed it quickly, probably sensing something was wrong. I paid the entire bill, left a generous tip because none of this was his fault, and then I walked out the front door. Just left. Didn't go back to the table. Didn't announce my departure. Just walked out into the cool evening air and got in my practical, boring car and drove away. My phone started ringing before I'd even made it home. First her, then my mother, then her again. I'd ignored all of them, hands tight on the steering wheel, jaw clenched so hard it ached. I walked into my apartment. Our apartment technically since she'd moved in 8 months ago, and the silence felt heavy. The calls kept coming. Text messages piled up. My mother wanted to know if I was okay. My girlfriend's messages progressed from confused to angry to panicked. Apparently, she'd assumed I'd come back to the table. When I didn't, and when the waiter informed them the bill was already settled, she'd realized I'd actually left. She'd sat there with my parents, waiting for me to return, until Dad had quietly suggested maybe she should call someone for a ride. That's when it got interesting. She didn't have her wallet. She'd left it at home, something she did often since I always paid for things anyway. She'd had to call her brother, asking him to drive 40 minutes into the city to pick her up. My parents had apparently offered to drive her, but she'd refused, probably too humiliated to spend another second in their company. By the time I finally listened to her voicemails, they'd evolved from demanding explanations to crying apologies to angry accusations about me embarrassing her. Her brother had called too, chewing me out for abandoning his sister at a restaurant. I deleted that one halfway through. My parents showed up at my apartment an hour later. I'd let them in, and we'd sat in my living room while I explained that it wasn't just about that one comment. Mom had nodded like she'd already figured that out. Dad had asked me what I wanted to do, not what I should do, but what I wanted. That distinction mattered. I told them I wanted her gone. Not eventually, not after a cooling-off period, not after she apologized. Just gone. Mom had squeezed my hand and told me they'd book a hotel for the night, that I should handle what I needed to handle, and they'd take me to breakfast in the morning. Dad had hugged me at the door, this brief tight embrace, and told me he was proud of me for knowing my worth. After they left, I'd started gathering her things. Not frantically, not angrily, just methodically. Clothes into suitcases, toiletries into boxes, books and decorations, and all the little pieces of someone else's life that had infiltrated mine. It took hours. She had so much stuff. I hadn't realized how much until I was packing it all up. She came home around midnight. Her brother must have given her a ride. I heard her key in the lock, heard her tentative footsteps in the hallway. She'd found me in the bedroom, surrounded by packed boxes and suitcases. The look on her face had been pure shock. She'd asked me what I was doing, and I'd told her I was helping her pack. She'd laughed nervously, said I was being ridiculous, that we needed to talk about what happened. I'd said no. Actually, we didn't. I told her she'd made herself perfectly clear. She was waiting for me to mature, financially and emotionally, which meant she didn't want who I was now. So she was free to wait somewhere else. That's when she'd started crying, saying she didn't mean it like that I was overreacting, that it was just a comment. I'd asked her how she did mean it then, and she'd stumbled over her words, trying to backtrack, trying to soften what couldn't be softened. I'd asked her if she loved me, or if she loved what she thought I could become with enough training. She couldn't answer that. Not honestly. Instead, she'd gotten angry, accused me of being childish, of throwing away 3 years over one statement. I'd reminded her that she'd made that statement in front of my parents, people who had welcomed her into their family, and she'd done it while sitting in a restaurant I was paying for. I told her the cruelty of that wasn't lost on me. She'd tried a different approach then, softening her voice, reaching for me. She'd said we could work through this, that couples fought, that this didn't have to end everything. I'd stepped back from her touch and told her I wasn't interested in being someone's fixer-upper, their project, their investment that might pay off eventually. I told her I wanted someone who looked at me and saw enough, not potential. The crying had intensified. She'd begged me to reconsider, promising she'd never say anything like that again, that she appreciated everything I did. But I'd heard what I needed to hear. It wasn't about the words themselves. It was about what they revealed. She'd been tolerating present me while waiting for future me, the version with more money and less opinions and probably fewer practical cars. I'd told her she had until morning to get her things out. I'd sleep on the couch. She could take the bedroom and pack whatever I'd missed. She'd asked where she was supposed to go, and I'd suggested her brother's place since he seemed so invested in our relationship. She'd called me cold, heartless, cruel. I'd said nothing. Update 1. She didn't leave in the morning. I'd woken up on the couch to find her in the kitchen making coffee, like it was any normal day. She'd tried to act like the previous night hadn't happened, asking me if I wanted eggs, talking about her plans for the day. I'd walked past her, poured my own coffee, and started loading her boxes into my car. That had broken through her denial. She'd followed me, asking me what I was doing, her voice rising with each trip I made from the apartment to the parking lot. I told her I was taking her things to her brother's apartment since she seemed unable to do it herself. She'd blocked the doorway, trying to physically prevent me from leaving with another box. I'd simply waited until she moved. The drive to her brother's place was silent despite her sitting in the passenger seat. She'd insisted on coming, said I couldn't just dump her stuff like garbage. I'd agreed, which was why I was carefully delivering it instead of leaving it on the curb. Her brother wasn't home when we arrived. I'd stacked the boxes and suitcases neatly outside his door, made 3 trips while she watched with tears streaming down her face. On the last trip, she'd grabbed my arm and asked me if 3 years meant nothing to me. I'd looked at her directly and told her they meant something right up until I understood what they meant to her. A waiting period. An investment. I asked her if she'd ever actually loved me or just loved the potential return. She'd slapped me. Not hard, but the shock of it hung in the air between us. She'd immediately apologized, reaching for me again, but I'd already turned away. I'd gotten in my car and driven off, watching her in the rearview mirror getting smaller and smaller until I turned the corner. My parents had been waiting at the breakfast place, and one look at my face told them everything. Mom had ordered for all of us without asking what I wanted, some old comfort from childhood, and we'd eaten in relative quiet. Dad had eventually asked if it was done, and I'd nodded. Mom had asked if I was okay, and I'd shrugged because I honestly didn't know. The fallout was immediate and messy. Her friends started calling and texting, accusing me of abandoning her, of being unable to take criticism, of throwing away a good woman over nothing. Our mutual friends were split. Some understood, others thought I'd overreacted. I'd stopped trying to explain myself after the 3rd identical conversation. Her brother showed up at my apartment 2 days later. I'd let him in because I wasn't afraid of him and I didn't have anything to hide. He'd been aggressive at first, getting in my face about how I'd humiliated his sister. I'd asked him if she'd told him what she said to me in front of my parents. He'd hesitated, which told me she'd either lied or omitted that detail. I'd repeated her exact words to him, told him about the comment, the timing, the setting, everything. Watched his anger deflate slightly. He'd tried to argue that I should have handled it differently, that I should have talked to her privately instead of abandoning her. I'd asked him what exactly I should have said in that moment after she'd publicly announced she was settling for me temporarily. He didn't have an answer for that. Instead, he'd shifted tactics, told me she was devastated, that she'd made a mistake, that everyone deserved a second chance. I told him she'd get her second chance with someone else. He'd called me unforgiving, and I'd agreed. Some things didn't deserve forgiveness. After he left, I'd blocked her number, blocked her social media, blocked the mutual friends who kept trying to mediate. I'd learned a long time ago that sometimes the only way to heal was complete amputation, clean and quick. Work became my focus. I'd thrown myself into projects, volunteered for extra assignments, stayed late at the office. My boss had noticed, commented on my increased productivity, seemed pleased. I'd gotten recommended for a promotion I'd been passed over for 6 months earlier. The irony wasn't lost on me. Now that I wasn't spending money trying to prove myself to someone, my career was improving. Update 2. 3 weeks after the restaurant incident, my mother called with interesting news. Apparently, my ex had tried reaching out to her through Facebook. She'd sent a long message explaining that I'd misunderstood, that she'd actually meant something completely different, that cultural differences in how people expressed concern were at play. My mother, who had zero tolerance for manipulation, had responded with a single sentence telling her to leave our family alone. But the message itself was revealing. She tried to rewrite history, to paint her comment as concern about my stress levels and work-life balance rather than dissatisfaction with my income. She'd suggested to my mother that maybe I needed therapy to deal with my overreaction. Mom had screenshot the whole thing and sent it to me, along with several eye-roll emojis. That same week, I'd run into one of her friends at the grocery store. She'd cornered me by the produce section, demanding to know how I could be so heartless. I'd let her finish her speech, then quietly asked if my ex had mentioned what she'd said at dinner. She'd waved it off, said it was just a comment, that I was being oversensitive. I'd asked her if she'd be okay with her partner publicly announcing they were waiting for her to improve before she was acceptable. She'd started to respond, then stopped. I'd watched the gears turn, watched her expression shift from righteous anger to uncomfortable realization. She'd muttered something about it being different and walked away quickly. The thing about standing up for yourself is that people get really uncomfortable when you do it. They prefer you to be quietly dissatisfied, to swallow your hurt, to forgive and forget, because that's easier for everyone except you. When you draw a line and actually enforce it, suddenly you're difficult, you're uncompromising, you're the problem. My promotion came through officially. More money, better title, corner office. I'd celebrated by taking my parents out to dinner at that same Italian restaurant. We'd sat at a different table, and I'd ordered whatever I wanted without checking prices first. Dad had given me this knowing look across the table, proud and a little sad at the same time. Mom had raised her glass and toasted to knowing your worth. The waiter who'd served us that night with my ex had recognized me. He'd been professional, but I caught the flicker of understanding in his eyes. He'd probably seen 100 versions of what happened that night, just different players in the same tired script. He'd given me exceptional service, and I'd tipped even better than before. I'd started seeing someone new eventually, nothing serious, just coffee dates and casual conversation. She was a physical therapist, practical and funny, and when I picked her up in my practical boring car, she'd complimented how clean I kept it. When I'd taken her to a mid-range restaurant for our third date, she'd been enthusiastic about trying their burger special. She'd paid for her own meal without me having to ask, then suggested we split the bill on future dates. It felt easy in a way nothing with my ex ever had. There was no performance, no hidden scorecard, no sense that I was being evaluated for future potential. Just two people enjoying each other's company in the present tense. Update 3. 2 months after everything imploded, I'd gotten a LinkedIn message from my ex-professional platform, carefully worded, asking if I'd be willing to provide a reference for her job applications. The audacity was almost impressive. I deleted it without responding. Her brother had tried one more time, catching me at my gym. He'd been more measured this time, less aggressive. He'd told me she was struggling, that she'd had to move back in with their parents, that she was depressed. He'd asked me if I felt good about that, if I was happy with myself. I'd looked at him and told him honestly that I didn't feel good about it, but I didn't feel responsible for it either. I'd told him she'd made choices that revealed her character, and I'd made choices that protected mine. I'd asked him what he would have done if someone had told him his wife was just a placeholder until something better came along. He'd looked away. I'd also told him that maybe the depression she was feeling was actually shame in disguise, the discomfort of having to face consequences for once in her life. He'd started to argue, but I'd cut him off, reminded him that I'd supported her financially and emotionally for 3 years, that I'd never made her feel less than, that I'd treated her with respect right up until she made it clear she didn't respect me. I'd asked him to truly consider who was actually wronged in this situation. He'd left without another word, and I haven't heard from either of them since. The mutual friends who'd initially taken her side had started coming back around, quietly, awkwardly. A few had admitted they'd gotten more context, understood better why I'd reacted how I did. Others just acted like the whole thing never happened, inviting me to group events again without acknowledgement of the gap. I'd been selective about which bridges I repaired. My life had gotten smaller in some ways, quieter, but it was mine now in a way it hadn't been before. I'd started saying no to things I didn't want to do, stopped trying to prove anything to anyone, focused on what actually mattered to me rather than what looked good to others. I'd also started therapy, ironically enough, not because I'd overreacted, but because I wanted to understand why I'd accepted breadcrumbs for so long. My therapist had helped me see the pattern, how I'd confused sacrifice with love, how I'd let someone's potential become more important than their actual treatment of me. The restaurant incident had become something of a personal watershed moment. My friends joked about it sometimes, using it as shorthand for standing up for yourself. One had even walked out of a bad business meeting, texting me afterwards that he'd pulled a me. I'd laughed, but I understood what he meant. Sometimes walking away is the only move that preserves your dignity. 6 months later, my mother told me she'd seen my ex at the mall with someone new. She described him as older, obviously wealthy based on the designer everything, and how my ex had been hanging on his arm with that same calculating look Mom had noticed at dinner. She'd said it with a mix of vindication and pity, like watching someone run the same race they'd already lost. I'd felt nothing hearing it. Not satisfaction, not vindication, not even pity. Just the neutral acknowledgement of information that no longer affected me. That's how I knew I'd actually moved on, when her choices became background noise instead of a soundtrack to my life. I'm doing well now. Better than well, actually. The promotion led to other opportunities. My practical car still runs great. My boring clothes are comfortable. And I'm dating someone who looks at me like I'm enough exactly as I am, not a draft in need of revision. Sometimes I think about that dinner, about the moment she said those words. I wonder if she knew immediately that she'd crossed a line, or if she genuinely believed she was stating facts. I wonder if she's learned anything, or if she's just more careful about when she reveals her real thoughts. I wonder if she tells the story differently, makes me the villain, paints herself as the victim of my overreaction. But mostly, I don't think about it at all anymore. That night at the restaurant was the last time I let someone make me feel insufficient. Walking out that door wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning of refusing to apologize for being myself. Best decision I ever made.